Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make a tic-tac-toe game using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. First, I'll open up a Visual Studio Code folder with an index.html file. I can use the exclamation point shortcut to create a boilerplate. I can type in the title of the document, I'll call it tic-tac-toe. And in the body, I'll make a header tag with tic-tac-toe. Then I'll make a turn indicator, make that an H3, call it turn indicator. And that'll be like X's turn. We'll be changing this with JavaScript. Then we'll make the board. So let's say div.board. Inside we'll want squares. So I'll say dot square times 9. And at the bottom we'll want a button to start a new game. So say button.new game. Alright, so now I will press the Go Live button using Live Server extension to start up the server. It doesn't look too great right now, but that's because we haven't added styling yet. Let's create a new file called style.css. We'll need to link to it in our HTML, so we can create a link where the href will be style.css. In the style.css, we will want to create HTML. We'll say box sizing, border box. This will help us to align elements more easily. And we can say star before and star after box sizing inherit. This will allow every element, star will refer to any element, and it will set the box sizing to inherit, so you'll get border box on everything. We can set the background color here to, let's say, EEE, that'll be like a light gray. And we want the font family to be a sans serif font. Okay. The button should have some text on it so we can actually see what's going on. New game, we'll say. Okay. Let's say we want everything aligned center. I'll make a wrapper. We'll call it tic-tac-toe. And body, we'll set the display to be grid. Justify content center. Align items center. We want the height to be 100 viewport height. And the width is already going to be the full width. We'll set that anyway. Actually, we'll leave that out. Text align, we want to be center. Now the board is not actually showing up because the squares don't have any width. So we want to set these squares to have a width of 100 and a height of 100. Let's set them to have a border so you can see where they are. It's actually going to be square, not squares. 1 pixel, solid black. Okay, now let's say we want to align them in a grid. We'll set the parent element, which is .board, to have a display grid, and the grid column template columns will have repeat 3 auto, so that'll be 3 columns where every column has an auto sizing. And now we have a 3x3 grid. if we want to get rid of these edges on the top, left, right, and bottom, we can specify specific squares and remove the border. So we'll say dot square colon nth of type. We'll say 1 and 2 and 3. We will set the border top to be none. That will remove the top borders. Now the left will be 1, 4, and 7. We'll say border left none. And the right edge will be 3, 6, and 9. And the bottom is 7, 8, 9. So now we have something that looks more like a tic-tac-toe board. Let's add some spacing around this board because it's a little bit packed. We'll say margin 20 pixels for the top and bottom, and the left and right we'll set to auto. Maybe let's add a little bit more, let's say 40. Okay, now let's style this button a little bit. This button will set the background color, make it like a green, we'll say 008888. That looks good. We'll set the color to be white so it's readable. Get rid of the border. Add some padding. 15 pixels, 10 pixels, let's see what that looks like. Maybe let's add a little bit more on the sides. Alright, let's add a border radius to make it have rounded corners. Say border radius 4 pixels. I'll make it a little bit shorter. Yeah, that's good. Now, okay, let's add a shadow. Say box shadow. The first two numbers will be the offset, so we'll say 0 to have it align in the center of the button. And the vertical alignment we'll set to, let's say, 3 pixels. And you can use RGBA to specify the color. 0, 0, 0 will be black, and the alpha is the transparency, so we can set that to maybe 0.16. You can add a second shadow, say 0, 2 pixels, RGBA 000.26. So now we have a shadow over here. Let's make it like a little bit bigger. We need to specify the blur over here. We can say that's like 6 pixels for each of these. Make this one a little less. Okay, so now we got a kind of shadow over there. So now let's set the hover effect and say button colon hover. We can set the box shadow to be lower down, say 10 pixels, 20 pixels, and we have much bigger blur too. RGBA 0.16, and we'll add a second shadow, 0, 5 pixels, 6 pixels, RGBA 0, and 0.26. So now when we hover this, we should get a darker shadow. So it'll appear more spread out, so it'll appear like the button is higher on the page, so it's as if it's rising. But it doesn't look like a very smooth transition. So let's add a transition. Say it takes 0.2 seconds. We'll make it ease out. And we can say box shadow. So now it'll gradually increase. We should set the cursor when we hover this button to be a pointer, so we'll say cursor pointer. Okay, that's good. Now let's add a slight color change maybe. I say when we hover this button, we will set the background color to be 009999. So now, changes color. We should have the transition happen at the same time. So we can remove box shadow from here and just apply it to all effects. There we go. Now, let's say these squares should highlight in gray when we hover over them. So we will add dot square hover background color. We'll say DDD. Also add a transition here. Transition 0.2 seconds ease out. That's good. You also want the cursor to be a pointer, so say cursor pointer. And this is looking pretty good. So let's get started on the JavaScript, and we can come back to the styling when we find something that needs to be changed. We will start by calling it script.js. We'll need to include it in our HTML file. We can say script source equals script.js, and we'll have to add defer to make it so it runs at the end of the HTML, so we can use these elements that we create on the page in our JavaScript. Now, in our script.js, I'll create an object to organize things. We'll call it tic-tac-toe, and it will have functions as keys, and the values will be the functions themselves. So the function name will be a key. So let's start by making an init function, which will initialize the values. So that'll be a function. And what things will we need to do? We will need to reset the board. We'll need to add event listeners so we know what happens when we click. We'll start out by saying window.onload. We will call this function tic-tac-toe.init. So let's create a function called add event listeners. In this function, we will say for each of the squares, we need to add a click. So let's get started by saying tic-tac-toe dot squares, which will be a object that we can access within tic-tac-toe. It will be an array, so we'll say array dot from document dot, I'll close this, document dot query selector all dot square. So now this will select all square class elements from the DOM and create an array out of them. So now we can say this dot squares dot for each. We'll have to put a function here. We'll say function x. So x will refer to the current element that we're iterating over. So we'll say x.add event listener click. The function will be play. So we'll need to refer to the object again, but since we're in a function, this will refer to x. It will refer to the current square. So if we want to refer to tic-tac-toe again, we can say var ttt, which will refer to tic-tac-toe, equals this, And now inside of here we can use ttt.play this. .play will be our function that we'll call when we click a square. So let's add that. Play will be the function that will first set the content to your player's symbol. Then it will check if you won, and then check if there's a draw. And if it's not the end of the game, it will go to the next player's turn. These are things that our play function will have to do. First, I'll have to make sure that the square is not filled. So that will be an if statement. We'll say if we'll have an element passes the parameter. See, when we pass it this, we're passing the element we clicked on. So if element dot class list dot length equals 1, then we'll call this. We'll see when we add an element, we'll actually add a class name to the class list. So that's why equals 1 will work here. So set the comments to your player's symbol. We'll do this by setting the class list to add the current player's symbol. So we'll need to have a current player. Let's make a new game function which will be called every time we start a new game, which is going to be different from the init function. The init function will be when we create the page. The new game function will be every time we start a new game, so we can start a new game without restarting everything. So new game will set the player to, let's say, this dot player equals 0. We'll have it oscillate between 0 and 1. I'll call it active player so it's more clear what we're talking about. 0 will be the X's and 1 will be the O's. We can declare up here the symbols that we'll be using. Let's say tic-tac-toe dot symbols have an array of X and O. And so the element at 0 will be X, and the element at 1 will be O, so we can access the symbol from this list, and it can always be changed by changing the elements in this list for tic-tac-toe. So now, when we add a element here, we can add the symbol to the class list. So we'll say tic-tac-toe, or this dot symbols, subscript this dot active player, and this will give us X or O, and add it to the class list. Okay, we'll need to add a comma over here, and we'll need to call the add event listener function. We'll say tic-tac-toe dot add event listeners. And in the initializing function, we'll have to use tic-tac-toe to refer to this object, since this is where we're initializing things. But afterwards, we'll be able to use this to refer to tic-tac-toe, as long as we're not inside of a function. In that case, we'll have to use a variable that points to this instead. So now, we'll say add event listeners. So now, we should get the class name X. When we click on one of these squares, it says undefined. This dot active player should be equal to 0. That's because we didn't call the new game function. So we also have to call tic-tac-toe dot new game. And now if we click on a square, we'll get X. We do not yet write the function to change the next player's turn, but first I will add some styling so we can see what's going on. In style.css, we will go down to where we have square, and we go say dot square dot x, we can, I actually want to make a foreground and a background. So instead of having just square here, in each square, I'll want to have a element that will be the outline, and another element that will be the foreground, and we'll have that for all 9. So now every square we have outline and foreground. So now we'll say dot square dot x dot outline. This would be a black X. So to make a black X in CSS, we can modify the before and the after pseudo elements. In order to make these overlapping with each other, the outline and the foreground, we will need to set the position relative on the square, and on the outline and foreground, we'll need to set the position to absolute. So say dot square dot outline will be position absolute, and dot square dot foreground will also have position absolute. So now they'll be overlapping with each other. Now the outline before will have to set the content to be blank. This way it will show up. Second, we'll have to make the background color black for both of these. We'll set the width, let's say 8 pixels, and a height, say 52 pixels. We can always change this if it doesn't look right. We'll need to set the position to absolute. And we want to center this. So on square, we will set the display to, we can say flex. And we want to justify content center, align items center. Let's rotate this. We'll use transform to rotate 45 degrees. And for our other one, we'll want to set the transform to minus 45 degrees. So now we have it looks like an X. It's not perfectly centered though. Let's say display grid. This is, we don't want the display here, since this is containing both elements. We want it to be in the outline and also in the foreground, and this can be flex. Well, we need the height to be the same as the square, and also we'll set the width. There we go, now it's a centered X. Let's make it a bit thicker because we're going to want to put a X inside of there. So first I'll copy these, and for the copy we'll set the class to foreground, and the background color, we'll make it something red. So let's say 880000. Maybe we want to be like more of a pale red. Alright. And here, now we have them overlapping. So this one we'll want to, let's say, add 6 pixels to the width. So I have 3 on each side. So we'll make that 14. And also add 6 here, so we'll make that 58. And now we will have to do the same for the before. we should make sure that the foreground always appear above the outline, because in some browsers it might be interpreted differently. I'm not sure if it will, but we can make sure by saying z-index. We'll make this 3 for the foreground. We'll make it 2 for the outline. As long as the number is more, then it will appear above. Alright, now we need to work on the O. So, I will copy this. Now for the O, we want the outline to be a circle. We probably only need one of these pseudo elements. We don't need 2 elements. We will need the outline in the foreground. So dot square dot O. We'll set the background to be black. The width, it should be a circle. So let's say 58 pixels on height and width. The border radius should be set to 50%. That'll make it a circle. We should also set a border width. Say border is 8 pixels. We said it was 16 for the outline, 8 for the, or 14 for the outline and 8 for the foreground. So we'll say 16 pixels solid black, and we'll make the background be transparent. I will set the class name manually to O, because we haven't written the next turn function yet. So now we have the foreground there, and the outline in the foreground. We will need to also make it a circle. So the width will make it 52 pixels, and border radius 50%. The border will be 8 pixels. I said here that it should be 14. And the color will make it blue. We'll use this and maybe make it a little bit more pale. So the background here should be transparent. And there we go. Now we have a nice looking X and O. We can change the colors later if we feel that it would be nicer. But for now, we will work with these. Now let's go back to the script. Let's do the function to check if you won. So we'll say if this dot check win. We will separate into another function to check this. We will write check win function. It will return true if someone won, or false if you did not win. So we will say return. We'll need to check for some winning position. All of them are filled. So let's define what a winning position is in our init function. We'll say tic-tac-toe dot winning sets equals since JavaScript starts at 0 for arrays, this will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So the winning sets will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for the horizontal ones. For the vertical ones, we'll have 0, 3, 6, 1, 4, 7, and 2, 5, 8. And you can also win diagonally, so add 0, 4, 8, and 2, 4, 8. we return this dot winning sets dot sum. So sum is a function that will return true if any of the checks return true. So say function x, so x will be referring to an element within winning sets. So if one of the winning sets has only the same letter in it, which would be the active player's letter, then we'll return true. So this function should return whether x.every, we'll say function square so this will be the index of a square. I'll call it I actually. So I will be the index of the square. So we'll have to say tic-tac-toe dot squares. Since this is in a function, we can't actually use this. So we'll set ttt to this again for this function. And we'll say ttt dot squares at the index I dot class list dot index of. So I will check if a given string is a class within this element, and we will say this dot symbols of this dot active player, which is what we added as the class, and we'll say is greater than -1. This will return -1 if it cannot find it, and otherwise it will return the index, which should be 0 or 1. In this case, it will always be 1, since we had squares as the first class name. So we will return if every square in the row x, which is going to be one of these sets of numbers, like one of these. So let's say 0, 1, 2. So we'll check if the squares at 0 contains the class x, and it will say if at 1 it contains the class x, and if at 2 it contains the class x, then this will return true. And if any of these return true for any set within winning sets, then this function will return true, meaning that someone won the game. So now we will work on the draw function. We'll say else, because if they did not win, then they could have drawn. We'll say else if this dot check draw. This will be the function check draw function. This will have to check if every square on the board is filled. So we could say return this dot squares dot every function x, so x will refer to an element within the squares, x dot class list dot length is greater than 1. So length greater than 1 means that it does not just have the square class, it also has an x or an o. So now that we have these in, we can kind of temporarily just say alert win here and alert draw here. We'll make it look nicer later. Alert will just make a pop-up that contains some text. Go to the next player's turn is the most important part here, so we can actually play. We'll say else, in case there was not a win or a draw, we will go to the next player's turn. So in this case, we'll say this dot active player equals 1 minus this dot active player. Because if active player is 0, we want to set to 1, and if it's 1, we want to set to 0. So 1 minus this dot active player will cover both of those cases. So now let's test this with x. We did not get O. So let me alert this dot active player, so you can see what it's set to. So it's not actually getting to this part. So it does add the class, so we know it gets here. So now if this dot check win or this dot check draw is true, it would alert, and it didn't alert. Let's see if there's an error in the console. So it says cannot read property undefined of undefined at line 57. So in this function, we said this dot symbols. Really, we should have used ttt dot symbols because this refers to the element. And also here, we should use ttt dot active player instead of this dot active player. Dot index of is not a function. It's because class list returns a list of nodes which does not have an index of. But if we convert it to an array with array.from, then it will have a class list. We want the class list to be the array, so we can call index of. So now we change the player to 1. We will remove this alert since it's no longer necessary. XO, 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 X. X should 1. We did not alert win. Now if we click here, we do get a win, but didn't catch it the first time. Maybe we have a typo in our sets. We have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 0, 3, 6, 1, 4, 7, 2, 5, 8, 0, 4, 8, and 2, 4, 6. Right, so this diagonal had a mistake. It should have been 2, 4, 6 and not 2, 4, 8. So now we get a win over here by O. Our new game function hasn't been written yet. So now let's test the diagonal that had a problem last time. And now we get win. So now we want to rewrite this so that it will look nicer when we win. Instead of saying alert win, we will say set the turn indicator to say X wins. Also, we didn't change our turn indicator this whole time, so we should do that. And we also need to make sure that when the game is over, you can't continue playing. So that's a few things we'll need to do. First, I will set the turn indicator when we change the turn. We can say, let's make tic-tac-toe.turn indicator be a variable we can use. So that will be equal to document.querySelector turn indicator. So I would take the class name turn indicator and find the first element that matches. So now we can say this dot turn indicator dot inner text equals, we'll get the symbol, this dot symbols dot at this dot active player plus space, or we'll say apostrophe s space turn period. So now it should rotate between X's turn and O's turn. And when someone wins, we will set the turn indicator. So this dot turn indicator dot inner text equals, we'll get the active player symbol, and we'll say plus space wins exclamation point. And when there's a draw, we will set it to say it's a draw. So now we get O's turn, X's turn. When X wins, it says X wins. So now, let's make a variable called game over. When the game is over, we will say this dot game over equals true. So that was when it's a draw or someone won. When we start a new game, we will set this dot game over to false. Also, when it's a new game, we want to clear out all of the data from the squares. So we will say this dot squares dot for each, say function x dot class list. We'll say x dot class list dot remove x, and x dot class list dot remove O. We will also want to, on our init function, or in our add event listener function, we want to set the button to just call new game. So we will say tic-tac-toe dot button equals document dot query selector dot new game. I believe that's what we called it. It is. So now we can say in our add event listener function, this dot button dot add event listener click. Let's try creating a function that calls tic-tac-toe.newGame. There we go. So now it clears the board when we click on new game. So X wins. We can click new game. We don't want to allow playing once the game is over, so in here we want to say this dot game over. We can say not this dot game over, so that means this is not game over, and the class list length is 1. So now when the game ends, we cannot click on another square. We should remove the cursor from our styling when we've already played on there, and also when the game ends. So I'll actually add a class name to the board when the game ends. So I'll actually make a new function. We will say, call it game over, and it'll be the function. First of all, it needs to take this dot game over equals true, because in any case we want to set this variable to true. We also want to add a class name to the board. So we do not yet have a variable for the board, so I'll create one tic-tac-toe dot board equals document dot query selector dot board. So now we can say this dot board dot class list dot add. We can say game over, and when we create a new game, we want to remove that. And in our styling, we want to say over here is where we said we want to add the background color. So right after this, we have a dot game over. Inside a dot square that you're hovering, we want to set the background color to be transparent, which is the default, and we want to set the cursor to default. The game is over. To add the class name to the board. The board still just has the class name board. So let's check what we did here. Did we call the game over function? I think we forgot to do that. Let's write this dot game over. Alright, game over can't be the name of a function and a variable at the same time, so we'll call this function endgame. So now X wins, and now there's no more highlighting of anything. We also want it to be, when we have an X in the square, you shouldn't be able to still hover over it because it is no longer available. So we can add another class selector here. We'll say dot square dot X hover and dot square dot O hover. So now these do not get hover, but these ones still do. So only the available squares will be able to have a hover effect. And our draw function, should check that out. We want to return this, since it returns a true if all of these return true, but we did not give a return statement. So now it's a draw. The new game function will start over. We want to set the turn indicator when we start the game, so it doesn't just say it's a draw at the beginning. So we will say this dot turn indicator dot inner text equals this player's turn. We should actually make a function for this because we're doing it more than once. So we'll say set turn indicator function that will take this and it will say it's this player's turn. So now we call set this dot turn indicator at the beginning of the game, and also when we change the player's turn. You're missing a comma over here. X's turn, O's turn, and X wins. And we can make O win, and we can make it a draw, and everything seems to be working. We can start a new game. We can play as many times as we'd like. Sometimes X will win, sometimes O will win, and we have some cool animations when we hover over the button and on the grid. So that's about it. I hope you learned something. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. Bye.